I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Sarah Perry, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. The Essex Serpent was really the book that put Sarah on the map in the United States. It was also a B&N Discover pick back in the day. I mean, what, 2016?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, long time now.
And then there was Melmoth. And now we've got Enlightenment. And, we're taping this in advance of publication, so I'm just going to say, as always, there are no spoilers in this conversation because what's the fun in that? But Sarah, having revisited Essex Serpent and Melmoth, I feel like there's a thread running through all three of these books. Mm-hmm. That even though Melmoth is in Prague and, Essex Serpent is, the Victorian era in Essex, England. And now we're in sort of 97, 2007, 2017.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's call it present day, right?
Yeah.
It's not the 80s. We're not technically in historical fiction anymore.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Can we talk about how we got to Enlightenment? Because I feel like you're still wrestling with similar questions.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think I've reached the stage of my career now where I'm able to see these kind of unifying threads through all of my books, and that I'm preoccupied with the same questions of what I tend to think of as a kind of taxonomy of love. So different types of love, whether that's friendship or desire or family love, friendship between the generations as it is in Enlightenment, all those kind of boundaries between different types of love. And then also the tussle between religion and science, and a kind of sense of wonder, and to what extent wonder itself is almost like a kind of proxy for either religious faith or kind of some sense of the spiritual. And I guess, these are the things that preoccupy me as a person, and I write out of a kind of integrity of my own preoccupations, and so they come up again and again in the books.
Thomas and Grace are sort of the two main characters of Enlightenment. I'm going to leave out some of the cast. They're terrific. It is a tight cast. There is a little bit of a mystery at the center of this that involves a woman called Maria. But I really want to focus on Thomas and Grace because they are the big beating heart of Enlightenment, and they are exactly what you are describing. They have been friends since Grace was a baby. I would not have imagined them as friends. I really wouldn't have. Though I had a lot of older people in my life growing up where I was like, oh, you're the coolest. Even as like a 6-year-old, I'm just like, hi.
Yeah.
Hang out with you?
Yeah.
Where did they come from?
I often shock people when I admit that my characters are plot devices. I create them in order to convey story and to convey an idea. And I think people are sometimes quite disappointed by this. What they would rather hear is that I was visited in the dead of night by some glorious character that I couldn't bear to leave. And actually, that's not quite the way it happened. But I must say, the characters in Enlightenment ran away from me far more than any of my other characters have done. So I began with the idea of Grace, who was born and brought up in a chapel very like the one I was born and brought up in a small town in Essex in England, where the habits and the religion and the theology of the church were really essentially Victorian. So she's an outsider. She's kind of very out of pace with modernity, feels very out of place. And I wanted her to have an attachment to somebody else who had a similar upbringing to her and wants her to kind of have access to the world and access to something broader than the chapel. And so I had the idea of an older man in the church. And to begin with, he was quite peripheral. And then I fell in love with him and invested more and more and more of myself in Thomas, until really Thomas became the major character and the narrator, in a sense, the narrator of the book. I mean, the book took me 6 years to write, and it was extraordinary to me how they grew and compounded and became more sophisticated over the 6 years that I was doing it. They really surprised me in some ways.
Like what?
I began to have an interest in astronomy.
Okay.
I've always had an interest in astronomy, all my life. And I bought a really good telescope just before the pandemic. And to begin with, there wasn't really that much of a connection between astronomy and the novel, like a vague idea that the moon might in some way be important. And then as I studied astronomy and studied physics and used my telescope, Thomas Hart in the book began to use a telescope and began to study astronomy. And together, Thomas and I became amateur astronomers over the course of the years that it took to write the book. And then astronomy and the study of physics became a kind of proxy or replacement for a very strict religious faith that Thomas once had and that I used to have. And so we became very meshed together. Thoughts about the world, our thoughts about God, our thoughts about science. And then Grace, as I lived more with Grace, I was able to write about parts of my own childhood and my sense of dislocation from the modern world and give more and more of that to Grace. So they really became very different from what I'd imagined in a way that is very different from previous novels.
I do still think of you as sort of playing with this idea of coming of age, though. And it's something you do in Essex Serpent as well, because I'm one of these people who believes that a coming of age story should not be limited to a teenager or an adolescent or someone in their 20s. And I got very attached to Thomas. I got attached to Grace, but I got very attached to Thomas, which surprised me a little bit. And watching his evolution felt so significant and surprising for him as a character.
Yeah.
And then you make him a newspaper man, and I'm thinking, okay, you're just going to keep breaking my heart, aren't you? Because obviously but these tiny papers, right? These tiny papers that dotted the United States and dotted the UK. I mean, a lot of great stories came out of those papers, like sometimes national stories that picked up from these, tiny meetings that someone went to. And I love the idea that he is so a part of his community, and he's writing these columns, and we see you write his columns for him. They're great. I mean, if you've grown up in any place with a small paper, like, you know who this guy is, or at least your parents know who this guy is. And it's part of the charm for me is the evolution of that piece of the business.
I think so. And I'm so pleased that you say that. I mean, Thomas Hart, I love and feel and see more than any of my characters. And you're right, he's 50. Is he 50 when the novel begins? 50?
Yeah, I think so.
And then he's in his 70s by the end of the book. And so we see his enlightenment, really, and Grace's and that of other characters. But he grows into an understanding of himself and an understanding of his sexuality and an understanding of love and failed love and disappointed love, and into a better relationship with his sense of himself in the world, where he belongs in the world. And, you're absolutely right. And I'm so glad you see this. We can come of age, we can attain enlightenment at any stage in our lives, and ideally over and over again. We don't become fixed at 25 or even at 30. We should be constantly engaging with the world with this sense of kind of wonder and learning. And it's so interesting to me that whenever I talk about Thomas, I kind of develop this really soppy smile as if I'm talking about some very loved character that I don't get to see very often. And it really is very new to me that I should feel this degree of affection, as if it isn't just my imagination. It's really strange.
But I think you and I are also talking about Thomas as a character in a way that plenty of earlier readers were talking about Cora from Essex Serpent, because Cora was my girl. Like, absolutely, she was the reason that I glommed onto that book as hard as I did. And, if you have not read The Essex Serpent, all I can say is summer reading is coming up. It's a really good time to do it. But beyond that, she is so of her time, even though she's a Victorian woman. Like, you give her a way to sort of loosen the hold of the Victorian world on her, and she's off in Essex digging in holes. And she's a fabulous character, but she's true to her time. And yet I don't feel like I'm having historical fiction shoved up my nose when I'm reading The Essex Serpent. I feel like I'm in the moment. I'm in this world that you've created. And it is very much your world. It is very Gothic. It's very dark. And I feel similarly about Enlightenment. And again, 97 was not that long ago. It really wasn't. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it wasn't. And I feel similarly where I'm dropped into this world. I don't know Essex. I've never been there outside of your novels. I did not watch that reality show. I know there was a reality show set, but I also haven't seen Jersey Shore, so I have no leg to stand on. But can we talk about Essex? Because it feels like Melmoth, obviously, again, Prague, but Essex has a hold on you as a human, as an author, as a thinker, that I don't think we can separate the works from the plays.
No, we can't. And it's a really good question. And I'm asked quite often why I write so much about Essex. I've written a non-fiction book about Essex as well. And in a sense, the most honest answer is that that is the matter of which I am made. I was born and brought up in Essex, and it is in me to see the Essex landscape, to see the great houses of Essex, to see the farmland, to see the marshes, to see the modern towns, which are sometimes rather run down, sometimes rather lovely. If you say to me, what does a cottage look like? I see a pink thatched cottage, because traditionally a lot of the cottages in Essex were painted pale pink and they were thatched. And if you say, envisage a field with a tree, I see a very faint incline in a big field with maybe the yellow flowers of oilseed rape and a huge sentinel oak with ivy growing up the trunk. That's my landscape. And there is an integrity to an author writing out of what is most familiar to them. And it enables you to have an inside out view of your novel. So rather than me sort of writing the landscape as an observer, I'm writing as if I'm part of the landscape. It is not something that I'm sort of choosing to depict. It just is what is there. And I think that's partly what gives what I understand my novels to have this very immersive feeling, because that's what I am immersed in. So you're looking at the landscape through me and I'm in it, I'm part of it. But there's something else. There's a political strand to this. So Essex is not admired at all in the UK. It's something of a joke. There is a sense that there's nothing there worth visiting. There's nothing there that's very interesting, and none of which is true. And there is a little bit of an anarchist in me that wants to subvert the status quo. So the more I write these literary novels that insist on the beauty and the strangeness of the landscape, I'm sort of thumbing my nose at the British idea of Essex, which is that, you know, it's not worth visiting. So that gives me a lot of pleasure.
I was about to say, happy to help with that mission. Wherever we can subvert narratives, we like to do that around these parts, because, I mean, you are writing about class. You are writing about a world. I mean, when I think of Grace's dad and her aunt, for instance, and where they live and how they live, it's not just a function of being strict Baptist. It really is also just class and money and all sorts of things like that. And it does, to me, feel like a world that I understand very quickly, even though it is not necessarily my exact world. And that's why I read.
It's wonderful to me that you talk about class, because, you know, there is something, I think, because my novels exist in this kind of almost a sort of alternate world where it is the real world and it is real Essex. It is contemporary Essex in Enlightenment. It doesn't have a direct and obvious link to the contemporary or to contemporary politics, but class and money is really important in Enlightenment, because Grace and Thomas are not posh, right? They're not kind of upper middle class. They're what we would kind of call like lower middle class or kind of aspirant working class. They struggle for money. Their houses are very small. They're sort of the traditional British kind of Victorian terraces that kind of like 50% of us live in Victorian terraced houses. Grace, when she grows up, she hasn't got twopence to rub together and she lives in this very dilapidated cold flat. And that is quite essential to them, because the smallness of their world, you don't have money and you don't have class connections, and you are brought up in effectively a religious sect. You don't have the means to break out, go and, be a chalet girl, go and be an au pair in Paris, learn about what, it's not going to happen to them. So the class is intrinsic to their experience of living this very enclosed world.
Part of what I love in the setup of Enlightenment is Grace sort of muddling her way through. She's not a typical teenager. I mean, her clothing alone. And she ends up being a really talented seamstress who's really doing like a level of work that is extraordinary. But she is immediately familiar because, I mean, every teenager is basically a baby giraffe figuring out their world.
That's right, yeah.
But you allow her a bit more of a struggle and a little bit more of a temper than other writers might have let her. Like, she is, I don't think I've really met a character like her recently where she's like, yeah, I'm just mad at all of you.
Yeah.
You want me to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm just mad. And it was kind of refreshing to see, because there are times too where, the baby giraffe is expected to behave a certain way and you're just like, no.
Yeah. She is furious, and I'm a feminist, and that should go without saying. But I'm also somebody who doesn't write as a woman. I don't consider myself a woman writer. I'm just a novelist. And I feel no great obligation to have female lead characters or to write about a particular kind of female experience. I consider every kind of human experience that falls more or less within my understanding and within my capacity to speak, they're all mine, whether they're male or female. And so, Thomas is a white strip Baptist, who's interested in astronomy, and he's from Essex. The fact that he's a gay man, to me, doesn't put him beyond my sphere of capacity to speak. And so I don't feel this obligation to write women. However, I do think that Grace's rage is female rage. Yeah. I don't think she knows that, because she's raised in a religious environment where she wouldn't be taught about feminism. She wouldn't be taught about, like a particular kind of female oppression. But her rage is a female rage. She's never had a day's freedom in her entire life. She has been raised to believe that she is either one of the elect and will see the face of God when she dies, or and the whole world is paved with sin. And so everything that happens to her, she feels powerless. So even though she starts to kind of develop her body, she starts to realize that she contains kind of sexual potential, she's not excited, she's furious. If she falls in love, she's furious because she understands that she is now vulnerable and she's powerless. And when her father wants to discipline her to bring her nearer to God, she's furious. And I found it so liberating to make her so angry and to make her do things that are wrong. My characters are not little avatars of, identifiable, these are good people. They do things that are wrong because we all do. And that's kind of okay. But yeah, she has a temper.
It makes her very interesting, the choices that she makes. And I am dancing around a couple of things. Oh, I'm dancing around. But she does a couple of things where I got incredibly annoyed for the right reasons. But to realize that I was responding to a fictional character with that kind of intensity is really satisfying. Like, you had me completely locked in, and I was so mad. And I thought, well, this is fitting. I earned this. Grace earned this. Like, we're all just in the place where there's this incredible wellspring of emotion. And if you think about how Thomas and Grace were raised, the idea that you've been able to take this moment and put the emotion out there, and I'm thinking they wouldn't know what to do with this. Neither of them. Neither of these characters would have the first clue. And Thomas, certainly, he doesn't. Such a nice man, but really.
I know. And one of my duties, and I do think it's a duty as a novelist, is to encourage readers to think very carefully about what they consider to be good behavior and bad behavior and what they're prepared to forgive. There's a kind of discourse at the moment that you see on kind of book talk, which I understand, and I don't condemn or deplore or think it's foolish, but the idea that characters in books should be avatars for the virtue of the writer.
No, thank you.
Reader, absolutely not. My characters are sinners, the way we all are, in the sense that we all have the capacity to fail, to wound, to injure, to do damage. But we have equal capacity to redeem ourselves and to find a place of forgiveness and to find a place of kind of grace and of radiance. And so over and over again in my novels, I make my characters do things that I know will really, really wind people up. And to this day, if I do a book signing, there's bound to be 2 or 3 people in the queue who are furious with me that Cora and Will in the Essex Serpent have a sexual relationship, because they were made to sympathise with and understand and celebrate something that they think is wrong. And actually, that's part of the function of literature, is to hold up to you a kind of mirror and say, but what would you do? And how would you feel? And can you forgive them? And what does that say about your ethics? So, when Grace lets herself down, she betrays, and she's spiteful and she's angry. Well, aren't we all? And that's okay. And it's okay to be angry with her. It's good to be angry with her.
But also, I think Grace, or at least my feeling is, she doesn't quite understand the pin that she's pulled from a hand grenade. Yeah. And I think that's a big piece of it. And it's not just a function of her age. It is a function of everything, right?
Yeah.
Like nature versus nurture kind of thing.
Absolutely.
It is absolutely a function of everything. But one of the things I love when I'm reading you is that you don't hold your worlds or your characters or your sentences hostage to nostalgia. And there's this danger, right, that comes with writing about the past, whether it's the Victorian era or even 1997. I have heard people talking about the 90s in a way where I'm like, were we on the same planet at the same time? Because I don't think we were. Or even when you think about 2005, like, what? Time has gotten very slippery and very weird, but people's nostalgia for the past, whatever that past moment is wild to me.
Yeah.
It is completely, I'm like, why are you not looking forward? We have stuff we need to do. Let's keep going. And I love the absence of this warm wrap of nostalgia where you're like, yeah, no, actually.
I think, honestly, that's a function of the fact that I don't really see time in the way that other people do. So because I was raised out of time, you know, I often say to people I was born in 1850 because that's the most accurate description of the way my upbringing was and you know, the kind of books that I had to read and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Victorian age really wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't. I was taught to crochet by a Victorian because my great grandmother was born in 1900. So my great grandmother was a Victorian. She was the woman that taught me how to crochet, right? I'm not old. I'm only in my mid 40s, right? And I have touched a Victorian. And so when I wrote the Essex Serpent, the Victorian age was chosen for a number of reasons, but not for its distance in the past. And so that's why I never wrote about it as a kind of Victoriana theme park. I wrote about it as a modern age. And so 1997, 2007, 2017, 1897, all of these times I treat in the same way as both alive and strange. So I think I write in a way that kind of blurs these boundaries and refuses the idea that, you know, human beings have essentially changed their nature in some way. And, you know, if it was better or, you know, people's desires were different or their faith was different, none of that's the case.
It seems too, just listening to you talk, that it's been really clear that you have really been thinking about being a writer and thinking about these ideas since you were small.
Yeah.
This all feels like a sort of, I know you just said you started studying physics and astronomy for this book, but the bigger stuff feels like you've been questioning everything since, you know, you were still in pinafores and Mary Janes. I don't know if you had, I don't know what you call them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I still wear pinafores and Mary Janes.
Okay. Well, but still.
No, absolutely. So I have never imagined that I would ever do anything but write books. And I actually came to writing very late. My debut was published when I was 34. And that was the first book I wrote, you know, so I wasn't somebody who actually did it for a very long time, but I inhabited this. I've always inhabited a kind of second place wherever I am. So wherever I am at the same time in another world or a parallel world or a previous world or a future world. It's as if my mind is kind of divided into the real reality of, you know, my laptop as I talk to you now and this conversation. Even now, my brain is kind of unspooling a series of other narratives in this place or in this time or in another place or in another time. And I've been like that since I was very small. I've never known my mind to operate in another way. And a lot of that is an intellectual as much as a creative process. So even when I was a very small child, I would be thinking, you know, but why is the sun doing that? Why is the grass doing that? How is this happening? What does that mean? Why did you say that? What do you really mean when you say that? And so I think eventually novel writing is a way for me to process and capture what is constantly going on in my mind, always has been, and turn it into story rather than sort of driving me insane.
Right. So I read for voice first. That's like voice is the thing that if I don't have it, and it can be close third, it can be first person, it could be polyphonic. It doesn't, if the voice of the novel is there, I'm in. And I'm wondering for you as the writer, when you know you found the voice. I mean, there is similarity sort of in tone and timbre between Essex and Melmoth and Enlightenment. And I feel like I know when I see something by you and read something by you that I'm reading you.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, you have an MFA and a PhD, but I still think the voice goes beyond formal coursework.
Oh, yeah. I would say that style and voice are the elements of the book to which I give no thought at all. Absolutely none. That is just the way I speak. That is just, it's like when I type with these hands because that's in my hands. And when I write with that voice because that's my voice. So for me, it isn't finding the voice or the style or the prose style. It's finding the lock in the door. And I know it's there, and I have to kind of keep picking and picking until I find my way in. And actually, Enlightenment was a very good exercise in this for me, because I began by trying to write away from my voice. So the first draft of this book was like an exercise in developing a different type of voice and a different type of style. And it took me 1.5 years. It was very short and it was agonizing. And the best example I can think of, it was like I'd written it with my left hand and I'm right-handed. And the minute I stopped doing that and stopped trying to develop a different style or to write in a more contemporary way, as soon as I spoke just in the way that I speak, then the book kind of ran away from me and became what it did. The style of my prose, that's the thing that causes me least trouble. And if I try, there's a disaster. I have to not try.
I do feel like there's a connection, though, between Helen and Grace, Helen from Melmoth and Grace, and sort of that loneliness and that isolation. And there's a level of pain, I think, in those two. And again, it might just be that I've also read them together very closely. I mean, I originally read Melmoth in 18? It came out. Essex Serpent was 16, Melmoth was 18. So it had been a minute. And then started to sit with all 3 books in a much closer reading period. I may be adding something to that. But it does feel like there's a connection between those 2 characters.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there is a sense of sin and guilt that interests me enormously.
Right.
For all sorts of reasons, my upbringing and the fact that I think that it's a useful thing to think about. I think it's useful to think about whether you have failed in some way or let yourself down, not met the standards that you set for yourself. And Helen in Melmoth is obviously haunted by that to an extraordinary degree. She's the exemplar of, what do you do when you kind of punish yourself? But what they are both working out is, do we sometimes choose to do something that we know is wrong? And what do you do with yourself afterwards? So no spoilers, but Grace chooses to do something that, as an adult, she kind of lets everybody down twice, I would say. So
yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair description.
She does something in a temper when she's a child. And then when she's an adult, she's caught in this devastating atmosphere of love and disappointment and wanting and desire. And rather than saying, I don't know what the right thing to do is, she understands that you can know what the right thing to do is according to society or according to scripture because of the way she was brought up, and you can choose not to do it. And then what do you do after that? And so these questions of ethics, of personal ethics and of broader ethics really compel me. And it just really delights me to think about my readers like throwing a book across the room. And a reader will throw the book across the room partly because they too have felt that impulse. That's the value of literature. It's holding up a mirror at a funny angle, and you see yourself from this angle and you think, I didn't think anyone had noticed. But they have noticed, and that's what the book is for.
It is one of the great pleasures of reading. I'm actually just smiling thinking about all of the books that I have actually sent airborne. I also, I believe in dog earing. I write all over things. There are people who think I'm a complete barbarian because I do these things. But, to be in conversation with a piece of art, right, is a totally different thing. And every single reader brings a different thing. Yeah. They bring their own story in as well.
The book is a conversation between the reader and the writer. The book exists at the moment when it is being read, and it is therefore a subtly different book each time. And that's kind of the wonder of the writing.
Well, and if I think just using a very simple example, Essex Serpent, I mean, the first time I read it, it was a bound manuscript. I didn't have the great, I literally had the Essex Serpent on a piece of white paper. So I didn't even really know what I was getting. I had no copy, no nothing. I just got a thing. And I was like, all right, I'll start reading. And I was like, wait a minute, what is happening here? And then, of course, when you come back to it after you've had, the Apple TV streaming with Claire Danes and Tom Hiddleston, and quite recommend that as well. But to have all of these different pieces and lots of prizes awarded and certainly gobs and gobs of copies sold, it was kind of trippy to come back to it and be like, oh, right, I remember sort of what it was like to read this book for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's a delight to dip back into that world and be like, oh, right, Cora, you really are a fantastic character.
Yeah.
She is one of my favorites, without a doubt. Essex Serpent came out of you finding a pamphlet about an actual Essex Serpent.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, or my husband mentioning it to me on a podcast. Yeah.
Enlightenment, though, not a similar. I mean, there's a little bit of a historical piece to Enlightenment that you and I are completely avoiding. But I'm wondering if there was a similar kind of moment that brought in that storyline for you, if you just really did start with what I think of as the heart of the book, Thomas and Grace.
So the novel has a theme of astronomy and searching for a comet running through it. And there's two reasons why that should be the case. One of them is that my father was a scientist. Say was, I mean, he's still with us, fortunately, and he had a telescope. So I was brought up with an eye to the telescope. And in 1986, when I was 6 years old, Halley's Comet came round. And I have this incredibly strong, visceral sense memory of standing in the back garden of our little house in Chelmsford, watching for Comet Halley. And I was in my dressing gown, and I can feel the dressing gown. I can see the telescope, which is white, touch the telescope on the optical tube, and it was really chilly. And I can see Halley's Comet appearing very slowly above the garden shed as it got darker and darker. And all I wanted was to live long enough to see Halley's Comet again. So the idea of like a comet's trajectory marking out the years of your life was really important to me. And I actually have a tattoo of Halley's Comet on my ribs underneath my heart. So this is how important it is. And then about 4 years ago, just after the pandemic, I went to visit my parents. And I said to my dad, do you remember when we stood in the back garden in 1986 and we said comet, and we saw Halley's Comet? And he said, no, we didn't. I said, what? This is like a foundational memory of my childhood and sort of building my consciousness. He said, no. Famously, it was the worst viewing conditions for Halley's Comet in 1,000 years because of where it settled in its orbit. And it was completely cloudy and we never saw it. But I believed I saw it and I loved it. And I just want to see it again. And it set me thinking about how the path of bodies in orbit, of the moon and the stars and of comets and the planets, can offer a kind of model for so much of how we feel. Is it necessary to really know somebody in order to fall in love with them? Do we need to even have seen them at all for the love to be very, very real? And so astronomy, and then as I got my telescope and I started watching it more and more, the laws of Kepler on the motion of bodies in orbit became the organizing principle of the book and became almost like parables for understanding the human heart.
And that seems like a really great place to end this conversation because we're dangerously close to spoilers again. Sarah Perry, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Enlightenment's out now. If you haven't read The Essex Serpent or Melmoth yet, please go find those two.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.